Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our panel on strategic stability in cyberspace. I'm Erica Borgard. I'm an assistant professor at the Army Cyber Institute. I'm really excited to be here this afternoon and sharing the stage with these fantastic panelists. We have Herb Lynn, Jason Healy, Catherine Lotriante, and they're all bringing their wealth of knowledge and experience to this topic. So we'll start with the panelists introducing themselves, and then we'll get started. Herb, do you want to start?
So I introduced myself. I'm Herb Lynn. I'm from Stanford University.
Thanks.
Jay Healy, right now with Columbia University, SIPA. Got to start. I helped set up the first cyber command, Joint Task Force CND 20 years ago. We're coming up on our 20th anniversary, December 1998. And then my perspective is coming from both the military side, then I went on to be the vice chairman of the FS-ISAC for information sharing, White House, and now an academic.
So I'm Catherine Lotriante. When Jay started doing this, his beard was not the same color.
My students say that if I'm twirling my right mustache, they're on the right track, and if I twirl the left...
Oh, you have a tell.
Yeah, but
okay.
I think they're making it up.
Yeah, just trying to fake you out. Well, thanks for having me, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm at Atlantic Council and also teach at Georgetown University. An international lawyer by training. I teach national security law and international law. Now at Atlantic Council, building up the Cyber International conference that I was doing for years at Georgetown. And my background in the government was from the intelligence community. I was a lawyer at CIA and at the White House, and at one time right out of law school at DOJ as well.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. So to give you all a sense of where we're headed this afternoon, I'm going to be facilitating what I hope will be a lively and thought-provoking conversation between the panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. And just to give you some background on sort of the concept of strategic stability and sort of why we're talking about it, you may remember, or some of you may not remember, strategic stability was a concept that really took root during the good old days or the bad old days, depending on your perspective, of the Cold War. And it came to mean a range of different things to academics and practitioners. So for some, strategic stability was more narrowly defined as being something akin to crisis stability or arms racing stability. In other words, the factors that sort of dampen the incentives of the Soviet Union or the United States to escalate to nuclear war or to engage in arms racing behavior. And for others, strategic stability was conceptualized more broadly as sort of the absence of outright conflict or hostilities between the nuclear armed superpowers. So today, the current environment in cyberspace has been described by some to be one of persistent engagement, where you have a diverse set of cyber actors who are continuously contesting one another below the use of force threshold. And in this environment, we find ourselves asking what strategic stability is, whether it's possible to achieve, what it might look like. So I want to start off our discussion with Herb. I'm hoping you could sort of tackle this first conceptual question, which is, when we use the term strategic stability to describe cyberspace, what do we even mean by that? And what does strategic stability look like? Is it achievable?
Well, I've heard two different definitions of it, which roughly parallel the things that you, at least one of them parallels the notion of stability in the nuclear age. You talked about crisis stability, and the crisis stability in nuclear terms is the condition under which both, if you have it, then neither side has an incentive to attack first. Okay, that's the crisis stability part, and if you don't have the incentive, you stay at peace. So you could say that a broader conception of strategic stability in the nuclear domain would be that, plus a kind of an arms race stability that you mentioned too, where neither side has an incentive to keep on building. And so that's one definition of it. Of course, there's another definition of stability, which is the condition of overwhelming superiority, in which we can do everything we want and the bad guys can't do anything that they want. And that view of stability, I mean, sure, I'm not saying anything about achievability, but in principle, one could have that, where you had overwhelming superiority and nobody else dares to do anything against your interest because they're scared of you, scared of the consequences. And that's also a stable world. Now, it may not be very fair, it may not be attainable, but that's at least one view of it. The interesting thing in the nuclear business is that the US view of it, of stability, has vacillated between those two extremes, okay? So our declaratory policy on nuclear stability has always been the first. Crisis stability, secure second strike forces and all this other stuff that, that we say is a condition. But our operational policy has always been, we want to go kill those guys, submarines and missiles and so on. We're not willing to leave them alone. We're not willing to have them have a deterrent force. And so we've gone back and forth. You see the same things in cyberspace. There are two different views of it, that there's a view of stability in cyberspace that says that neither side has incentives to act in a hostile way. We would like that to be a defense-dominant. People talk about that as a defense-dominant environment. Trouble is, nobody knows how to achieve a defense-dominant environment in any meaningful way. And then so we have the other view that we have to be mixing it up with them continually. That's the focus of the new cyber strategy that Commander's vision of Cyber Command, and we're going to have to mix it up with them continuously based on the premise, on the observation, which I think is undeniable, that a policy of restraint in cyberspace hasn't worked. And so, there are all kinds of escalation issues associated with the new strategy, which people have been relatively silent on. But those are real, but nobody knows whether or not the new strategy is actually going to make anything better. And it may, in fact, be that things get worse before they get better. But, I think the answer is no one knows.
Jay, I know you've done a lot of thinking on making cyberspace more defensible. So, it's heard you talk about whether defense dominance is possible. How much of that is a function of the inherent factors of the domain versus some of the sort of organizational innovations, Jay, that you've written about for like the New York Cyber Task Force?
Yeah, and there's so much. That was such a rich part, Herb. Thanks for leading us off. One of my partners at Columbia is a professor named Bob Jervis. And everyone go, ooh. He's one of those guys. And so he wrote about the security dilemma, which is where if one side is getting arms, then everyone else sees that they're getting arms, and they might get nervous, and then you just end up in this spiral escalation where everyone doesn't know what everyone else's intent is, so they just keep arming themselves. He said that is doubly dangerous, that is destabilizing, if you can't distinguish offense from defense, and it's offense dominant. Because if it's offense dominant, then those capabilities might be used in a surprise attack. And if it's offense versus defense, then you can't distinguish if the person is building this for valid defensive reasons or for offensive reasons. Like think UK and Germany prior to World War I, right? Each side would want to build more battleships, and they were doing that for maybe valid reasons, but each new battleship was a threat to everyone else. But right, that describes what we say about our field. Offense dominant, and you can't distinguish offense from defense. We also can't distinguish offense from defense, offense from espionage, offense from operational prep of the environment, and we're not just stockpiling these weapons as in a real security dilemma, we're actually using them in persistent engagement. Right, so this may be far more destabilizing than we think. It might be that using more offensive cyber operations to induce stability might in fact cause the opposite. We can all imagine a lot of fights where deciding you're going to punch the other person harder and faster does not get them to back down, but in fact lets them lead that they want to punch back. So the lead in Erica gave was, if we could change that factor of defense, that it's offense advantage, if we could give the defense more advantage, then that can help be stabilizing. Because now each side can now gain more offensive capability, and each one of those capabilities is less likely to make other countries feel like they might be facing an existential threat. that a digital Pearl Harbor might be looming on any particular day. Now, we haven't thought about that. We haven't said, what can we do to make cyberspace more defensible as a whole? So we did a New York Cyber Task Force where we looked together at these ideas. So we looked at technology, operations, and policies. Most of our solutions are across, within an enterprise and across cyberspace as a whole. Most of our innovations are technology inside the enterprise. We can actually make cyberspace much more defensible looking at the technology across cyberspace as a whole. For example, if we get a new widget, brand new firewall, it's gonna make you perfectly secure. We get to buy 1 billion of them, deploy 1 billion of them, maintain 1 billion of them. When we do end-to-end encryption or Windows Update, you do it once and it helps 1 billion. And so we need those things like that give the defense the most advantage over the attackers at the greatest scale and the least cost. And I'll just say on the last, we also overlooked the operational innovations. We had to invent the idea of computer emergency response teams in '88 after the Morris Worm. We had to invent the idea of a CISO. That was an invention after Citibank got hit by Vladimir Levin in '95. We had to invent the idea of ISACs in 1998 with PDD 63. So the thing about kill chain, it's free, it's an idea, it's a doctrine. And look at how it changed, helped make us more defensible with an idea, it's free. And so we can try and make defense better than offense, and I think that needs to be our goal as defenders. Thank you.
Well, so sort of pulling on that thread a little bit, I sort of have a two-part question. You know, what are the potential pathways to escalation if you believe that a more proactive approach could trigger instability? And then conversely, you know, if we can all generally agree that the status quo as it exists right now is not stable, and we want to get to a status quo that's more stable, other than sort of defending forward, what is a means to do that? That's sort of less destabilizing, if you're making the argument that defending forward is potentially sort of a trigger of escalation and destabilizing.
Are you?
To any of the panelists.
Well,
So I can talk about the norms part
Yeah.
of it if you wanted the law.
Sure, yeah.
And often when we talk about deterrence strategy, the folks drafting and thinking about it may not be thinking about international law. Typically the normative and legal framework is separate. But I've thought and written about this in the context of, in fact, it's the law and norms that historically have supported deterrence and therefore stability. It's often not thought of, though, because you got to take it out of a classic deterrence way of thinking about retaliation to raise the cost or defense to make it too impossible for them, right, to be beneficial for them to attack you. But if you think about the legal framework, and if you want a lot of boring discussion of the law, the last issue of CDR, I wrote an extensive, similar to a law review article, a cyber defense review, West Point's journal. It was the summer issue. It's very lengthy, so I'm gonna make this short. In terms of thinking about the international rules that exist, it's beyond just the norms that may be agreed to informally at the UN that's been going on, the non-binding norms, and I can talk about those as well, but there are legal principles that ever since, mainly it was the post-World War II, kind of the liberal legal order that was developed that's still operational. And those rules included the UN Charter and this framework that was agreed to related to the use of force. All applicable in cyberspace, but what is often not thought about is how these rules actually can support the framework or a strategy of deterrence. It is similar to when Joe Nye and others talk about deterrence and this one example of deterrence of entanglement. But often when we think of entanglement as part of a deterrence strategy, it is entangling countries in economic agreements so they have no interest in really harming each other. But the laws it's different because you are entangling them. You're entangling them in legally binding rules for which if they violate those rules under the law, there are consequences. Now, here's the catch though. They are useless though in supporting deterrence if there is no willingness on the part of the international community, whether unilaterally, bilaterally, or universally as a group, Other states are, if they're not willing to hold those that break the rules accountable. So if you don't, that whole accountability, and it ties in with attribution and political willness. And when we say accountability, I talk about countermeasures and use of force in response. It's very technical in the law, but there are a variety of consequences depending on what rule has been broken under these agreements. Some are based in treaty like the UN, but many are also based in customary law. This is the space we're in when we're in constant contact, right? And often, when people have, with the cyber command vision, it was almost as if people thought this was a new thing. But if you go back to the Cold War, we might not have been in a hot war, but we were in constant contact with our adversaries. And at times, there were people dying because of it. So there was use of force. It was just a Cold War because it never escalated to use of nuclear weapons. So we have been in this state, and in fact, as an international lawyer, one might think that I would always talk about a state of peace. I don't think, and I go back in history looking at not only the historical events, but the laws that were in place, I'm not sure I can point to a time when there was actually a true peace. When I think about peace, I'm talking there's no constant conflict, even at a lower level. But we have been at low-level conflict for a long time. Now we just have a new domain called cyber in which that will also continue in. And so we have to adjust how we see the rules, how we've applied them. But using the rules, the key to it is that you understand what the rules are, you understand the triggers or the thresholds for violations of those rules, and that states are also willing and able to react to those violations of the thresholds. If you do not have accountability and reactions to violations of the law, then they'll be useless in terms of the intent to support deterrence, to prevent others from doing what they should not be doing in the cyber domain.
Herb, I think you have a
So,
follow-up.
Erica, you mentioned, your question was about most likely paths to escalation, and Catherine has described one scenario in which deterrence fails. So let me build on that. In terms of inadvertent, to me, the real danger is inadvertent escalation. And this, I'm going to talk in a little bit of an abstract term. I'm willing to believe that we're the good guys and the Russians are the bad guys. Okay, to me is perfectly, I believe that. But it's not going to work if I base my policy on the assumption that the Russians know that we're the good guys and the Russians know that they're the bad guys. That does not work, right? So the idea that they will trust that our intentions are benign is just not true, right? You can't assume that. Okay? Any adversary will have their own reasons for thinking, for doing what they want, for looking at the United States in the way in which they do. Okay? We can't assume that they think our intentions are benign. Let me give you an example. Okay? This is entirely hypothetical. Okay? Imagine a crisis between the United States and some other nuclear-armed nation. Okay? So there's a crisis, right? And what do we do in a crisis? We need more intelligence information. So we spin up our cyber guys to do more gathering of intelligence. We want to know whether or not the movement of mobile missiles on their side is is part of a planned exercise or whether it's somehow a departure from normal. So we spin up our intelligence gathering activities. This is, from our standpoint, we need this information. This is a good thing, right? It promotes stability to know what they're doing. This is great. Let's say they detect this during the middle of crisis. Our cyber tools and capabilities are being exercised in their nuclear command and control networks now, looking around. What are they going to think? Are they going to say, oh no, that's the Americans, they're okay. I mean, it's okay that they're in our networks. They just want intelligence information. We just have to reassure them. No, nobody here believes that they would react that way. That's escalation to me. That's the potential for escalation.
So, go ahead, Jen.
And I love that. It's this opportunities for mistake and miscalculation, especially as the military really believes in the tactical determination, right? We are in the fight. Don't make us check in for any political oversight, right? We heard General Stewart on this stage, right? We need to be able to engage with the Russians wherever we find them, even if it means redefining what sovereignty means. And we need to be able to do that without checking in back to the White House, right? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had U-2s that were going off track, and the Soviets had to decide whether that was intentional on our part. And of course, it is part of human nature to assume intentionality by the other side, especially during a crisis. The Navy had a new anti-submarine warfare strategy where they were using practice depth charges that really blew up to help annoy Soviet subs that had nuclear torpedoes near the line of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Which we didn't know about. We didn't know about the nukes.
But it was standard ASW practice at that point that we were going to drop explosives on Soviet subs. And that was all separate. You know, Kennedy didn't know any about that. They didn't any of that in the NSC. So we have these things that might be standard military practice that are just occurring in there. And there's one extra point, if I can pile on Herb's point. Imagine that there's a good chance that I might be getting in a fight with my neighbor who's a martial artist. And as a matter of fact, this guy just really makes sure everybody knows how powerful their offense is. You know, they're cracking cinder blocks to brandish their capability. Everybody knows how good their cyber offense is. Oops. If I think their offense is really good, then I have to sucker punch them. And the more threatening and the more offense strong they are, the more incentive that I have to sucker punch them if I think a fight is possible, or certainly if it's likely. So perversely, the more that we talk about our offensive capability in cyberspace, we might be inviting that first strike. If an adversary thinks the fight is going to come anyhow, they might have to take a shot at us first in using cyberspace.
Well, on that, so here's where I think the law, though, is helpful. You can have offensive military capabilities, and coupling that with the rules that are announced that in which you would use them is how you signal to adversaries and allies how we're going to go about controlling the use of offensive weapons. And the laws of war and also the UN Charter and customary international law has done that over the years, meaning we've had, every time there's been a first country that develops the first dangerous weapon. And so that is not necessarily meant that then it triggers escalation and use of, they might then go ahead and build it, but then with rules of how you're going to use these weapons developing, there can be more of a sense that, okay, one, we're going to control our own weapons to make sure that they don't get into the bad hands of bad actors, and the UN has spoken about that, like the terrorists. Then we're going to have rules about how the state itself, which has these weapons, will use them or not use them, and who would be a legitimate target or no. So the laws can kind of combine with the inevitable development of these weapons, as long as, one, there can be some development of consensus among the rules, which one apply, and how they apply. And that has been what's been going on in the cyber domain.
Yeah, go ahead.
How does what you said square with the U.S. embrace of anticipatory self-defense?
Well, because anticipatory self-defense is based in international customary law.
I understand, but fine.
So they're actually using
reading
it.
of, yeah.
Peace. No pun intended.
So it,
yes, I understand. But the environment in which in an environment in which all nations accept the idea, which they don't, but assume everybody accepted the U.S. position, that anticipatory self-defense was an okay thing to do, okay, under their interpretation of the law. How does that promote stability?
so here it's important to kind of say what the principle is. Under anticipatory self-defense and customary law, at one point, the United States actually was not a proponent of the development of this custom. It only came at a time where we saw the rise of non-state actors, particularly terrorists, with the Israelis being the lead in this. They were the first country to say, listen, here's what we're facing. We have threats on our border. We cannot wait. And there's a famous 1981 Osirak reactor case. That when the Israelis actually fired upon that reactor, it was taken to the Security Council. In '81, the Security Council said that was an unlawful use of force under anticipatory self-defense. But what was important, and the lawyers get into this, not because anticipatory self-defense was not a legal principle, but it was because the framework, the pillars of that principle, and this is where all lawyers say the details matter, right? You don't just throw out ASD and say either you got it or you don't. Anticipatory self-defense, it depends on if you met the criteria. Security Council looked at the criteria and said, in this case, the Israelis did not meet the requirements, the criteria required to meet the standard of anticipatory self-defense. What is that? Okay. Under the words of our former Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, the threat has to be overwhelming, no time for deliberation, no other means to resolve the dispute. Now, over the years, as practice has developed and courts have opined upon it and state officials have talked about that, well, what does that mean? You have to have an imminent threat facing you, right? There's an imminence and a necessity criteria. Imminence is that it's coming, right? It's on its way. So the Security Council looked at the facts of the Osirik reactor and said that was not a fully developed reactor. Therefore, the threat was not imminent. Now, we should go back to 2003 and the Iraq invasion. That is why most international lawyers found that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 did not meet any anticipatory self-defense standard or Article 51 of the UN Charter. And since we didn't have Security Council authority, but that wasn't cyber, of course. So, and neither was Osirik.
Mike Schmidt's writing his question down right now.
Hi, Mike. So the anticipatory self-defense, you have to know the criteria. Sometimes the facts are, it will be meant. Now, some of the, and I think it's, Mike will correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's Yoram Denstein it's the interceptive, where his view on interpreting anticipatory self-defense is that it's not when you just have the bullet loaded in a gun, and that's just a made-up thing. It's when you're about to launch it, right? Or that it's on its way, or the missile has been launched, or an interceptive. I think he calls it interceptive. I forget the words. So the timeliness of things is where the imminent standard comes down. So time matters. So it's not just capabilities, though, and here's where the intelligence aspect comes in. If you are going to argue anticipatory self-defense, the imminent standard requires you to have damn good intelligence. Because you need, and sometimes, not just the US, we're not so good at this aspect of intelligence, because it's not intelligence about specific factual things you can see, whether clandestinely or not. It's about the intent of individuals, particularly the leaders of a country.
And if I can,
so do they intend to launch that weapon?
But compare this to what General Stewart said on this stage yesterday, right? He was so brilliant in the way that he laid out the dynamics of cyber conflict and the way that he was making the case, right? He said, imagine being in front of that congressional committee and they said, well, you saw the gun being loaded and yet you did nothing. You knew that they had guns and you did nothing, right? What he was arguing for on this stage was the ability to go and disrupt, to use, we'll call it military force, that's not going to be the legal term, but cyber capabilities to go disrupt this, not as any kind of extraordinary thing, not even having to go back to ask the political leaders if they want to fight with China or Russia right now, but as a matter of course of standard military operations. And indeed, he said, we might want to redefine the issue of sovereignty so he can fight those Russians at any time and in any system where he finds them. That's what we're signing up to with this. A constant fight, meaning never ending, between military forces of nuclear-armed nations with no end in sight, wherever the military happens to find them, and with minimal checking back with the political leadership for stability, because that's going to help bring us back to norms. That's what we're arguing. I'm exaggerating a bit. I'm paraphrasing a bit. Yeah, Forrest is saying it's not a little bit, it's a ton. But I think if you saw the general, right, he was pretty eager in what he was aiming for. But even if I'm exaggerating, am I exaggerating about the direction? Am I exaggerating about the magnitude, and if by much? And so let's think about, is that really the way it's going to work? I'm sorry, Erica, you were trying to
No, that's all right. I have like 100 questions that I wanted to pull on all these threads, but you guys, you did a great job with the conversation. I guess I have a few thoughts. So one, Jay, like responding to your specific comments just now, and actually going back to something you said a little while ago, in terms of the idea of sort of defending forward and this sort of persistent engagement, with the elevation of Cyber Command to a unified combatant command, the counter-argument is, well, shouldn't Cyber Command act like the other unified combatant commands, where you have authorities that are delegated and you have, for the other unified combatant commands, clearly defined rules of engagement? Perhaps the solution is more, and this is sort of a question I'm proposing, do we just need to establish standing rules of engagement, which we don't yet have? And maybe that would clarify or not some of the issues you're talking about. And then the second question is, I'm glad you brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis, because so inadvertent escalation was, of course, a terrifying concept that became real during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one of the responses was the establishment of the Hotline, right? And actually, the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center it was reported that that Hotline was used during the 2016 elections by President Obama to signal to Putin, hey, don't interfere directly in the elections. So we sort of, with the realization that things could go horribly wrong in 1962, we developed confidence-building measures to signal and promote transparency and try to reduce the risk of an inadvertent escalation. Is that a potential solution to these problems you're identifying about potential inadvertent escalation? Are there mechanisms to promote transparency, just like we figured it out during the Cold War, right? Yep. More or less.
Yep.
Okay, so there is at least one known instance of a hotline between the US and another major power, China in particular, right, where we tried to use the hotline to resolve, to settle, to tamp down the reconnaissance airplane incident over Hainan,
yeah,
okay, early in the Bush administration. And my understanding of that story is, and we tried, and the Chinese never picked up. They never picked up the phone.
I heard that also, yeah.
Okay, so that's one thing. First, you got somebody on the other side has to answer. That the criteria one. Okay, and sometimes you can imagine, no, I'm making a political statement. I'm not going to answer it. You can imagine that happening. Some people say, no, I refuse to talk to you. That's something that all civilized nations do with each other. I don't like you, so I'm not going to talk to you. I don't like what you did. Okay,
you didn't invite me to prom.
Yeah, right. That's right. Okay, so that's one. Well, that's one part of it. The second part is, why would I believe anything that came over a hotline about cyber events? Okay, I'm gonna repeat my talking points. No, my intentions are benign. I mean, why would the whole point of cyber is fundamentally a place where that depends on deception. Okay? Nobody hacks into a system by saying, hi, click on this link and I'll destroy your hard disk or I'll give me access to it. No, they pretend to be something else. It's all a matter of deception in that. And why should a hotline be treated any differently in that context?
But it might help.
It might help. I could easily make the argument that it could hurt too. So some might help, might hurt.
And one of the things that's interesting in this is, when we were talking about nuclear, you could have, one of Jim Miller, he was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, he was also a political science PhD, who was really interesting in this. He could bring up and say, you know what, in the Cold War, we would have the war fighters, you'd have SAC there, and they are training to win, and they want to dominate, in your sense of stability, like they want to win. But we also said, you know what, it's stabilizing that the Soviets have infrared satellites watching our missile fields, because it gives them a lot of confidence that we're not going to do a surprise strike. Now, we might not like it for warfighting reasons, but you know what, for stability, it's good, and we should aim for stability as a government policy. We don't have that distinction in our space very much. The warfighting mentality of supremacy, of overmatch, are what's winning the day. Look at the document, right? The new strategies that have been coming out. They said, we want stable, but we want overmatch. So this is an existential threat, but we want overmatch, right? It's an existential threat for a lot of our adversaries too. Sometimes if you want stability, you have to aim for it. You had also asked about the standing rules of engagement, and shouldn't we treat this as a normal command? I started my Air Force career in cyber in 1998, and we were normalizing. AFPD 1030, no one would remember it now, that said we want to normalize the way cyber works in the Air Force. But we always change the definition of normal. On one hand, we say cyber is totally different. It's a different domain. It has different characteristics of mass maneuvers and surprise, for example. But then we say it's going to be normal. It's tough to treat it the same way. For example, one reason I don't want it normal, I want to throw speed bumps in front of our operations. Because when you hear Cyber Command folks say gray space, they pretty much mean someone else's personal property, right? That's what gray space is. It's a device that's owned by someone else, by a company, by a person that used investment, that used their own dollars or euros to buy something, configure it, and set it up. That is now being used for military purposes. So could we find some kind of SROEs that would fit? Yes, I helped write some of them in the late 90s, or at least draft them. So yes, we can, but we cannot forget that this is different. In the other domains of conflict, in general, the civilians will get out of your way when there's a fight coming. Here, we're fighting in the infrastructure that was built by the private citizens for their own purposes.
Apropos of here's a good example about what you might say over to Hotline. If you were talking conventional forces, you might say, and we'll both withdraw our forces from the contested area. Our ships will separate. What does doing that in cyberspace mean? What does standing down your cyber forces mean? Okay? I mean, I try, so I'm negotiating with you. You're on the Russian side, I'm on the American side, and I say, okay, no, this has gotten out of hand. Let's stand down. How will you know that I've done it?
Well, I think that it's a good point, and I'm not sure I have an answer for it. I think that the use of the hotline could be conceived of not just for that hypothetical, but to send a signal of intent across domain signal, right? So we're thinking about stability and instability only within the context of cyber, rather within a broader cross-domain context. So you're using a hotline that was established during the Cold War for one purpose, to send a signal, and the use of the hotline in itself is meant to signal the severity and importance of the issue to the person picking up the phone to make that call, right? Because historically we thought of that hotline in the context of, diffusing the risk of a nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. So by an American president picking up that same hotline and sending a signal, we treat this as significantly as we treated nuclear deterrence and crisis stability in a time of potential nuclear confrontation, and making that implicit cross-domain link too, I think could convey a more credible and believable signal.
So the hotline is fine, but I wouldn't waste too much time thinking about just the hotline. It will not solve everything for some of the reasons Herb pointed out. But there are other ways to send those signals, some of which have already been being done. So remember, when we developed the hotline, we did not have the development of sanctions yet. So during the Cold War, the issue of whether you can even carry out a unilateral economic sanction without UN Security Council blessing was an open question under international law. I mean, the Russians are still arguing that it's illegal, right? But the international community has come quite far since the Cold War, where as a signal to what is not accepted behavior, one of the tools, aside from a hotline, and it's irrelevant whether they answer the phone, right? Of course, you're going to use all your diplomatic channels and backdoor diplomacy. You can send the message, whether through a phone or any other way. You can also send messages these days digitally, and the U.S. has done that. So there are different ways, but you can also use the international legal system. The U.S. has been doing that. There has been effects. Economic sanctions can be slow, but they have proven to be useful. to be painful, particularly to Putin. As long as you have targeted and smart sanctions and you know where it's going to hurt them economically, you need smart people like we have at Treasury Department and state. We can do unilateral and even UN-backed economic sanctions. That is one of the most powerful tools, along with indictments that you've seen. Indictments, whether someone stands trial or not, it is another signal. And you can cramp someone's style when you put a visa block and that person wants to go vacationing in one of the lovely islands and then he or she gets picked up. And so there are multiple tools, if you will, that the president, not just this president, but the past president has been presented with in terms of smart options in and out of cyber. For cyber violations of their behavior in cyber domain, or in other domains. But you can couple it with, like you said, across domain very nicely. And the phone call is one of them.
Right.
I hate to ask for evidence here, but I'm going to ask anyway. Has there been any evidence at all offered by anyone that any of the sanctions that we've imposed on others for bad cyber behavior has resulted in any moderation of their bad cyber behavior?
Yeah, we've got some. In fact, Treasury Department has actually come out. Their job is to kind of let people know how it's been useful. I don't know if it was State Department or Treasury, but yes, have we seen change in behavior? Yes, directly related to some of the sanctions. Now, does that mean they've changed their behavior forever? No, and I don't think anyone in the U.S. government would believe that. Sanctions have developed. It's amazing from an international perspective to see where it's come from decades ago, where it wasn't actually a very useful tool. Not only was the law being debated, how you developed your sanctions, even the United States was one of the forward-leaning countries because of who we are in the financial global system and what power we have to leverage that. At the beginning, we weren't that smart about how we did sanctions because it was how we were first developing them. And then it became smart sanctions. Then it became targeted sanctions. Now they are quite sophisticated. And the lawyers at Treasury that are responsible working with Commerce and State, they've got a wealth of history now that they can also learn from and it's all particular to a country, right? And sometimes it's particular to a leader. Right? And his little friend of so-called oligarchs, right? Where do they have their money? How are they moving their money? Who are their friends in which country? What companies are friendly with them? Intelligence comes in, of course, to Treasury Department to help them build a case. They've gone to the UN, right, to justify sanctions. A lot of it developed in the counterterrorism, post 9/11, when we were freezing assets of terrorists and everyone at the UN is like, well, this seems unfair. Some of these, companies or these institutions are humanitarian organizations. So come to us and explain why you've got them on the asset freeze. Well, they're basically a front for Al-Qaeda. So they look humanitarian, but we'll explain. So there's quite a much more rigorous and wholesome, both at the UN, but also within the U.S. government itself. And the U.S. government is training other governments how to do this. And they've been pushing just this year, announcing that we're going to do this with our allies. No longer is it going to just be the U.S. doing sanctions, but the U.K. and other of our allies have started to kind of not only say we're going to speak out together, we're going to attribute together, we're also going to start pulling the punches and, it might be a little more comfortable, particularly in countries like Germany where they have other economic interests with some of these countries, but we're going to start doing these economic sanctions together, and that is a way to kind of become very powerful and control the adversary.
I think we're almost at the point where I want to hand it over to the audience for Q&A, but I have one last question for the panel, and that is, the one thing we haven't really spoken about yet is the role of the private sector in either promoting stability or potentially undermining it. So it's sort of anyone has a last word before we open it up for questions. I'm curious if anyone on the panel has thoughts on what is the role of the private sector in promoting stability and potentially undermining stability.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Just this last Monday with President Macron in France and the Digital Peace Initiative, and a lot of that. One of the reasons why the U.S. might not have signed on to that was associated with Microsoft, with the President Brad Smith, who was pushing and saying, "Hey, look, we're tired of our capabilities being weaponized by every government, including their own. This is going off the rails. Let's try and get some control over this." And states saying, the one reason the U.S. might not have signed on was saying, who are you to tell sovereign states how they ought to behave or not behave? And so, and I think there is a role, and I do welcome those things.
I think that one, everyone recognizes, including those in the U.S. government, the importance of the private sector as partners, both in terms of how the U.S. develops policy, how we're going to engage together in those domain. But there is, and sometimes I may be seeming a little harsh on one side, but there comes a time for the reality of if the government of the United States determines, and our national security system with the president on top as commander-in-chief determines that X, Y, and Z is necessary to do for the protection of our country, which is the number one, our companies that are incorporated in this country will need to follow. Right? I mean, just as everyone needs to follow the law, if it comes down to defense of our country. So I have, with companies, I think it's great. In the normative discussions, academics are now writing about how it used to be all states that are making international law, but now, particularly in the cyber norms, you see these companies doing a lot of good, right? Not only are they being innovative, giving people jobs, creating great companies and technology, but they're also developing rules. And I think it's great when companies say, here are the rules we're going to follow. Here's what I would say, one caveat. If I read any kind of accord from a company that says, under no circumstances, well, some of it is good, this is good. Under no circumstances will we do things that are bad to harm others purposely. Under no circumstances where we'll work with a government to harm others, okay? I would say, I would like a little more detail on that. And then on the last one, we will come to help any victim who is a target from another government. I would highlight that, pull that out and say, I want to know what that means. So for instance, hypothetically, the US is conducting cyber operations against Al-Qaeda, taking them down, right? So is there going to be a company that goes to their rescue? Okay, I would have a problem if that was a US company. And so I think it's a positive thing that companies want there to be stability and peace and everyone access to technology that's not corrupted. But historically, every country has had, and particularly from the intelligence community, there are needs that may call for whether it's a friendly use in cooperation with a company in a classified way or operational use that might not be all widely known. And there are rules about this in the intelligence community that the CEO would have to know if their company is going to be operationally being used. But generally, people might not be comfortable with that. A company might not be comfortable admitting that because they have to work in other countries. So the US government understands partnership, but I do think there's a time when you have to pause, read the tech accords, and ask, what exactly does that mean? Because if we're targeting a terrorist group, I would like to know if one of our companies is going to help them, because you might be compromising an intelligence op or a military operation.
I'll give you the
last
word.
word
Yes,
on this. I'm going to pick up on something that Jay started at the beginning, which was that stability is dependent on a defense-dominant world, okay, in information technology, and the private companies. Private sector companies have a key role in making that happen. That is, right now, all of the incentives for innovation call for essentially ignoring security, or at least ignoring it to just putting out the bare minimum of security that's necessary. That is, there are no market incentives for security when you're an innovator, when you're trying to bring out a product at first. And so, from my standpoint, there has to be some forcing function that says, from the very beginning, you need to start thinking about cybersecurity of your products as well. Not just, I know you've all heard it about cybersecurity has to be baked in and so on. That means you design it from the start. No, so security has to be part of the functional requirements, where you make trade-offs against functionality for other things. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not serious about doing cybersecurity.
And then when we do that, say Apple, the government comes and says, no, you made it too secure. You have to pull back the security. If there was a switch on the president's desk, and you flip that switch, and it's going to make the internet perfectly secure, no attacks are now possible.
That is not even ours.
I'm pretty sure I know which way Silicon Valley would say, and they'd tell the president to turn that switch. What would Cyber Command say?
Right.
What would the rest of the U.S. government say? I know what they would say too, and it's going to be a different answer than Silicon Valley. So when I hear this town say, we care about security, and I'm sorry, I get this a lot when I was a cadet and I'm an officer. We're the military. We're inculcated with the values. They care about profit. We care about a higher calling in the country. I know at the end of the day, the military folks are going to tell the president not to flip that switch because we like what we're getting. And so let's keep that in mind when we're thinking about what the private sector's got to do and what the government has to do.
So Jay got the last word.
Yes, fine. It was a good last word. I endorse it.
Thank you all for your thought-provoking discussion. I'm sure there are lots of questions in the audience, so I don't know if there's someone with a mic, maybe? Yeah. I think we have one over here.
Got a coffee, got to switch to water.
Is it on? Yes. Thanks. Fantastic panel. Sven Sakov from Tallinn, from a think tank. My question is relates to the past and kind of looking at 2016 and interference in U.S. elections. And in my opinion, a very late and very meek response by the Obama administration, considering that, the Russians interfered in an inherently sovereign function of a state, meaning election. Just went to listen to Mike Schmidt, so that's why I was able to pull out this sentence of inherently sovereign function. What would have you done at the Resolute desk if you would be sitting, in terms of basically what would have been a proper response and when to such a violation of U.S. Sovereignty? So, now there is literature out which says that actually many different options were debated. Tory Newland was trying to push things through NSC, but that was basically did not go anywhere. And then, we saw what happened.
So I have a response. I know it's going to sound unfriendly and unladylike, but there are many things that a country can do, and it doesn't even necessarily trigger, the use of force, armed attack discussion, but in response to something like that. So thinking, put my hat on, like back at CIA, if you have an adversary like Putin that's messed with your election and has been pretty effective at it, and you want to send a signal, you use whatever diplomatic channels you want to send the signal, but there are other tools that the intelligence community can use and has in the past in order to, if you will, give it back to him. And doesn't have to be through the election, any of his own elections. You can, and this has been done in the past, some of which has been publicly talked about, not necessarily about Putin, but in China. You could release, and this is one that I probably would vote for, although it seems not nice. You could release some nasty information about the leader of another country. That could be true information. It could be false information. You do it and you release it in a way that you know it's going to get to him and his trusted colleagues or his financial backers. Or you target some of his closest advisors and you do something like that to them. And that's not using any force, right? That's not, and nowadays you can do it through cyber means or you can do it through old-fashioned means, right? So there are a number of ways way below kind of the Article 2.4 level. And in the Cold War, that was a lot of what was being done, right? We weren't escalating to a higher armed attack threshold or even a use of force most of the time, but there was nasty business being done at the lower level, some of which was violating the sovereignty of a country, right? Others, and arguably, and I'm right in line with Mike on this one, on the violation of sovereignty when it comes to an election. So you can lawfully respond to a breach of your sovereignty, and something that I suggested would not be illegal as a response. Yeah. But I'm sure there are other ideas that people have.
Yeah. And I agree, on this brushback pitch, this American baseball analogy of these things to get them to go back. We had the national mission team, right? We had a team that was looking at the Russians and ways to disrupt. You can tell I'm kind of I'm very moderate in this. And this got me very aggressive. I was very aggressive in August 2016 when the reporting first started to come out. in using that to actively disrupt the Russian operations. I'm a little more cautious on the releasing information, right? One of the reasons why Putin might have intervened and been so brash is that he thought the United States was behind the Panama Papers, right? So in his mind, at least from some of the reporting by Sanger and others, he was doing this as a response to something that he thought we had done. And in fact, we might have. That might indeed have been a U.S. covert operation. So I'm sensitive to that ladder of escalation. I mean, I don't see that there was far up that ladder that we could go that he wasn't willing to go higher.
So here on the law, what's interesting about that is, let's assume that. The question you have to ask is, if the U.S. was responsible for the, whatever.
Panama Papers.
Yeah, the Dorset, whatever. Was that a violation, though, of any law?
Well,
right?
He doesn't care about that. We didn't
No,
care
no,
about that.
but
So,
if you're thinking about what you can legally do in response, and as a lawyer, I would always encourage heads of state to think about the law if they want to do something in response. So I would say, even if it's not true, but if Putin believes that, and he's saying, I've suffered an illegal a breach of an obligation by the U.S., he needs to be able to say that in order to violate our sovereignty. So I would ask, if we're playing out the scenario, what law is that in violation of? The Pentagon paper, I would say.
Panama Papers.
Because no matter how unpleasant that was for Putin, and no matter even if the U.S. was doing it, if it didn't violate any legal obligation under international law, he does not have the legal authority to violate our sovereignty.
the other
But
thing
he denies having done that in the first place.
Yeah. And if I can, so one other thing that I would have done, and Thomas Silva's had an article on this last year, NATO Article 4, right? Wasn't time for Article 5, but the charter says you can do an Article 4, which is a consultation amongst the members. And we could have said, we want to, our election is coming up, other elections are coming up. We want an Article 4 consultation on Russian election interference. We still haven't done it. Obama didn't do it, Trump didn't do it, Merkel didn't do it. We've had all sorts of opportunities to try and call such an Article 4. I don't know why we haven't.
Is there another question?
Thanks, Sven.
Hi, Patrick Barry from the New America Foundation, but I do work full-time for General Dynamics. But I wanted to ask a question that I think it's going to set up two scenarios, but which relate strongly to the concepts that you guys have been talking about. So it relates to the question of stability and also this question of cyber deterrence. So in scenario one, two examples. You've got a case where the U.S. enters into negotiations with the Iranian government to achieve an accord of some kind with respect to Iran's nuclear program. And coinciding with that, you, at least in terms of some private sector reporting, have a measured reduction in the amount of Iranian cyber activity that is being perpetuated against the United States. Another example, you have the case of the Obama-Xi agreement, where some combination of the threat of sanctions or law enforcement action, at least when measured, again, by openly available private sector analysis, seems to have at least temporarily resulted in the reduction of certain types of kind of carefully parsed activity by the Chinese government against the United States. To me, these would seem to be two examples of kind of the entanglement principle, right? Where we're entering into kind of a dialogue, maybe not a normative sort of global rules-based dialogue, but a bilateral dialogue that is at least introducing friction and resulting in maybe a reduction in the activity that we're seeing. On the other hand, sort of scenario B, you have an example, I think, Jason, that you've written about, which is that the one act of sort of military, the military achieving an amount of cyber deterrence was when the Russian military, through a series of actions that they took against the United States, may, if you buy the publicly available reporting, introduced a degree of reluctance on the part of U.S. actors to act against the Russians or pursue very aggressive responses to the 2016 election. So that seems to be the type of overwhelming force concept that, Herb, you've been talking about. You know, which of these two sort of scenarios do you see predominating kind of in the future? Is it going to be one, the other, some combination of the two? And, you know, is there a way in which we can sort of look at them as acting in tandem, or are they just generally mutually exclusive? Thanks.
When you give a choice of either or, the answer is always both. So my prediction is we'll see both. And sometimes they'll have some relationship to another. My guess is that nations don't have their acts together enough to be coherent in their way in which they they pursue things. So I suspect that they're going to be done sort of roughly into first order independently. There may be some second order coordination, but that's just my cynical view of it.
And just to explain what you meant on that second point there, in Ben Rhodes' book from the last days of the Obama administration, he said that some of the options in dealing with Russian election interference were taken off the table because of concern in the administration that the Russians were going to disrupt actual election infrastructure. D&I Clapper wrote or said, and this was in the Korn-Isikoff book as well as the Sanger book, that Clapper said some of the options were taken off the table against the Russians because of Black Energy Havoc's presence in the U.S. electrical grid. Right? So when you have a conversation about deterrence, right, the U.S., according to the participants that were involved in the decision, had their decision calculus changed. They took options off the table because of Russian presence in the grid. And so, yeah, so that's an interesting point. Now, I'll just say on your first one, because it is tough to choose. I think it was Schelling that said, I think it was Arms and Influence, that he said, if you're using cyber to compel someone, if you're using force to compel someone to stop what they're doing, that's kind of what we're in here, right? We want to use offensive cyber operations to a significant degree to compel the other folks to stop what they're doing. He said, when they stop doing the bad things that you don't want, you have to stop punching them. They have to have faith that if they stop what is angering you, that you have to stop punching them. And so that does not fit in with the military mindset, right? That means when they are vulnerable and yelling uncle, a lot of the folks that I remember from my military days, they say, that's when you hit them more because they're about to give up. If we're aiming for overmatch and supremacy or superiority, then you don't give up when they are weak. You try and finish them off, or you try and hit them harder. And so that's going to be interesting. And there's really come up in Bolton, when Bolton said, we are doing deterrence, and OPM is exactly the kind of thing that we want to deter, OPM-style incidents. Well, OPM was espionage. So are we really going to be unleashing this force for things that we're willing to do ourselves, right? That's your second sense, right? If you're really saying supremacy above all, that's a good thing. If you actually want it to be stable in a fight, you might have to, when they tap out, you might have to listen to them tap out. That's difficult, especially if you don't have a hotline.
So on the intelligence aspect, you can do that in terms of what Bolton is saying is that, listen, there's a certain amount of espionage
Great mustache.
that we can accept and that we have accepted over the years. In the intelligence community, among liaison services, there have always been unwritten rules about what are the limits for you operating in our country where we don't acknowledge you, although we know you're here, and there have always been consequences when an agency or an organization steps over that line. And usually the consequences you see publicly are people getting expelled from the country, right? Not even the ones that supposedly stepped over the line, and it becomes a political public. Most of what went on over the years is you would never see it in the public. In fact, it was the whole point of keeping that out of the public that the heads of the intelligence services with their political people on top wanted it done that way, quietly. But there were unwritten rules of limits of operation, of espionage operations. So in the cyber, OPM was an example of the scale and scope of that espionage act was unheard of before, right? And that's why you saw Clapper in testimony say, well, yeah, we would have done that, no problem, it's espionage. But it was the scale, and so there is a concern that you do not, even in intelligence, so outside of the military with bombs and weapons, as intelligence operations, you still want to have some control of those operations so they don't get out of control. But it is not going to be the laws of war. And it's going to be compromises among allies and not just allies. We have relationships with intelligence services of our adversaries, right, or our quasi-adversary friends. And that's how it's operated for years, and it still goes in the day. And by the way, that is actually a hotline that has been used in the past. It's not the traditional hotline, but the services are often used when the politicians can't talk to each other, right? And they're mad at each other, and they're walking out of summits on each other, and they're saying bad words to each other about each other. It's the intelligence services, because they know they have to keep relationship going, that they actually the politicians know that they still will have a backdoor channel when you can't do it through the diplomats. And that's like it's never called a hotline, it's liaison services.
Hi, Whit Wheeler, NDU Cyber Strategy Program. I guess to the two gentlemen there, your initial discussion about the escalatory dynamics, the potential anyway of this, I personally think the threat is real, but my question to you is, isn't there a conflation here that basically any target is the nuclear armed submarine that your two were making as you're talking about the worst case? I mean, isn't there a reasonable distinction between, trying to penetrate someone's nuclear command and control with trying to penetrate someone's email or a web server somewhere?
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and
Yes. I mean, they are not, I agree they're not equivalent. I was responding to the question that was asked, which was, what are some possible escalatory paths?
but also, I mean, it's difficult because one of the dynamics of cyber conflict that we don't talk about is cyber is universal, right? We are all using it. In the Cold War, the Soviets had different technology than we did. Here, the technologies are underpinning everything. They're interconnected so they can cascade. And I've heard it a number of times of saying, all right, well, if they're in this, they might be in other things. They're in the email, this is escalatory, they're in this. And so, of course, there are differences, and some are more likely to imply intent. If the Soviet, I'll call them the Soviets. The Soviet presence in the electrical grid, Black Energy Havocs, right? That's the intent of that is relatively clear. But there is a lot of chance for the mistake and miscalculation, right? Systems that one side might not think are particularly important might be particularly valued by the other side, especially because a lot of the leadership does not have experience in this, because we're not sure what we're getting into. And that's potentially destabilizing, right? We didn't have the rules agreed to as we did in the Cold War, like Catherine pointed out. Like, we're still figuring out the rules. Like, we kind of knew if we were going to do an exciter flight, flying B-52s or 130 so that we can get the radars to pop up, everyone kind of knew what was going to go involved in that, and I think we haven't quite figured these out yet.
Another question?
Hi, Benjamin Dinkin, American Cybersecurity Institute. My question is about the temporal disparity that we're seeing. I think a lot of what was spoken with stability here is the tension between wanting short-term results and the goal of long-term stability. And I think Mr. Healy was talking a lot about the general yesterday, and being active today and defending America today you may not be doing the same things to achieve that goal as you do to develop a long-term stability. So how do we start thinking long-term effectively and building that? Because people want actions, people want security now, and we want to do things that sound good today that are leading us down a potentially bad path towards lack of stability in the long term.
So it's interesting, I'm going back, one of the purposes of developing rules of behavior or international law is to get states to understand that in the short term, they may have to give up some things that they could otherwise do under international law for the benefit of long term. So just what you say, it's actually a fundamental principle of international law itself. And so the work of the State Department officials and other government officials at the UN that's had been going on for a number of years on trying to develop these norms, even though it wasn't the same as a rule of law in terms of a binding agreement, it was the same principle, that it was diplomats trying to get agreement on, hey, you might not like the fact that we're trying to negotiate a report that says don't use proxies during peacetime, right? That you can't use companies and others as proxies. But long term, if you commit yourself and restrict yourself in this way, we're going to have longer stability and benefits. And you don't always get the agreement on those, but it's the purpose and the function of the law to do just what you said. every state, now then it becomes a political question for every country, for instance, when they want to sign up to a treaty or not, whether they're at that moment in time that they're willing to give up the short-term benefits for the long-term hope and benefits. Often it's with the development of new technologies and the uncertainties of capability that you see that time frame taking a while. And it seems that ever since cyber became cyber and the internet stood up, that some people forgot how long it took before cyber existed to get states to agree to things. But any international lawyer will tell you, like some people spend their whole career waiting for something to be negotiated and agreed to. It takes a long time, but it is actually, the law is to do just what you're saying. It just means that that initial agreement on giving up the short-term benefits may take a while, particularly in cyber when we're not quite sure what the advantage you have over somebody else is. Or if we're both vulnerable, then we might be both willing to be more likely to agree. But if I'm just vulnerable and that guy isn't, I'm not sure I'm gonna compromise. Or if I think he's a cheater right now and I'm not gonna be able to verify his compliance, I'm not gonna be willing to compromise. And we have gotten screwed before by cheaters. On the Nuclear and Biological Weapons Convention, it took the US a number of years to figure out with verifiable evidence that the Russians had been cheating from the get-go. And it took a while. And it was, ironically, in 1998, when we were certain of this, that they proposed the first cyber war treaty, that there should be no cyber. And that's why the US just didn't even blink at that proposal at the UN in 98. Because it was like, really? You guys cheaters, right? On the other one, and we know that now, and it's public. And so how do you expect for us to take you seriously? But it takes time.
And for years, we've thought we could have it both ways, right? We could say, the Obama administration was all about balance, right? We can have it both ways. We can let General Alexander go off and do his things, and we can have a safe, secure internet. And I think that was a false choice. I think that was a false balance. It might be, in life, you can't always get both things that you want. And I think if we were to go back, we might have had to have said, we have to make a choice. And we either have to focus on defense and really prioritize defense, or we try and use the internet to the maximal purpose for espionage and other purposes. Think about COIN, right? You had a clear distinction in the strategies. Are we there to win the hearts and minds of the good folks, or to stab and bomb the bad folks, right? And you had to make that choice. Now some folks in COIN realize the more firepower you use does not necessarily lead to better national security outcomes. This might be one of those spaces, right? There's a lot of international crises where more military power is not going to help create a better solution. This might be one of those. There's a lot of writing, including by Bob Jervis and others, that say, if you want stability in international relations, you have to make it a goal for stability. If you try and think, well, I can go for something else like deterrence, and therefore also get stability, that you don't actually get it. You have to maximize for stability. No one has yet died intentionally from a cyber attack that I can tell directly. Or if you're looking at Ukrainian howitzer operators and others, right? I mean, but they were targeted by kinetic because of cyber. That's what I want to reinforce, right? I want stability so that if any of us cross that line, it's by intent, not by accident, mistake, or miscalculation. So I want to throw as much rebar and concrete into that line as I can so that we really aim for stability. And then how do you say? I say a sustainable cyberspace. I take it out of the military context and I say, do you think your kids, when they're your age, are going to have an internet that's as secure, as open, as free as the one we have today? Right? Using this terminology from the environment. Now, I doubt it. I mean, if you think they are, like if you think your kids are going to inherit something that as good as you have today, I think you really have to look at those trends. But anyhow, that's what I like
Based on the moonshot
to be able
report,
to.
though, the goal is we're going to have a new one.
Yeah.
Well,
That is secure.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Oh, we're out of time?
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Quick last word? No? Okay. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here.